Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is July 30th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to break down how, if Russia can't win on the battlefield, they might just be trying to win the information war. We'll break down how. Let's get into it. So, first off, there is no update to the battlefield map. Not necessarily shocking. As we've seen previously, generally Russia's rule is that when it makes battlefield gains, it pauses for 24 to 48 hours to consolidate them. And given the fact that their pace of their gains has been slower, just like an exhausted athlete, they're going to need more time to rest and refit before surging again. So nothing about this is exceptionally noteworthy. Of course, they continue. Multiple sources now have reported this gap where Ukrainian forces have apparently pushed the Russians back in Bohododichne. Again, I think labeling this as contested is definitely the right call. As you guys probably know, pushing an entrenched force out of woods like this is a tough challenge, but certainly possible. As you can see, it would make sense that if the Russians lost control of this bridge in Bohododichne, the next place where they can get resupplied is back here in Yaramivka. Makes sense that they would pull back to Pasika and not try to run resupply to forces all throughout this wooded area. So definitely, it seems plausible. Again, I'm going to wait and see, but always a rare occasion on this front to see Ukrainian forces actually push back, given that this is where the bulk of Russian forces are located. As always, the Kherson front, no updates there, but again, not necessarily an indication of going well or poorly, just an indication that the Ukrainian forces are not disclosing information about troop movements in the area, though I will be immensely curious once they do start to openly acknowledge progress, if any. However, given that Russia cannot seem to make any gains, what I do want to talk about is the death of Ukrainian POWs in the Olenivka, in the Russian-backed DNR region. Now, Russia's Ministry of Defense claim that 40 prisoners were killed, 75 wounded by a strike on a prison in a town called Olenivka, part of the Donetsk region, sort of held by separatists. Russia claims the death toll of 53 and accused Kiev of targeting the prison with the U.S.-made rockets. The Russia's claim is that Ukraine targeted it to stop the Ukrainian prisoners from speaking or disclosing information. We're going to talk. I'll cover both sides, and then we're going to talk about what's wrong with both of these statements. Of course, Ukraine claims that this was a Russia had killed the prisoners, and that they staged the shelling and attack in order to cover up their war crimes. Okay, obviously, the International Red Cross is asking for access to the site to evacuate the wounded. Now, under the Geneva Convention, the International Committee of the Red Cross is the designated NGO, a neutral party, who is supposed to have access to all prisoners of war in order to verify that they're being held and treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. And the Geneva Convention is very specific about the way that POWs are to be treated. So, first off, let's talk about both stories. Now, the idea that Ukraine targeted these prisoners to stop them from speaking is a little ridiculous, because these were Ukrainian troops captured in Mykolaiv, in the holdout in the Azov steel plant, or Mariupol, excuse me. And the problem is that happened something like 2 months ago. So if Russia's goal was to extract forced confessions or forced videos, 2 months is plenty of time to do it. You could use both, we'll call them unconventional methods, because if I use the T word that the Geneva Convention outlaws, of course, YouTube will demonetize me. But rest assured, 2 months is plenty of time to get someone to give a false confession or speak to the media. So if Ukraine's goal was to silence these troops, they sort of failed at it. But it wouldn't make any sense, right? It would have been too late. Why would you target your own troops, and why would you target troops who, if they had classified information to share or were going to be used as propaganda pieces, that time would already have passed. That would have already happened. In contrast, Ukraine's allegation that these troops were executed and then Russia staged an attack on the prison to cover it up is somewhat more plausible, but it still doesn't make a ton of sense, given that Russia moved the prisoners to that location only a few days prior. And again, if your goal is to perpetrate a war crime and then cover it up, there's a lot of easier ways to do it than to move around dead or soon to be executed POWs. Instead, this is what I think happened. I think when you look, so the Geneva Convention is very clear. This is the location of Olenivka. It's a small town outside of Donetsk, right? But when we look at the actual combat map, we see that this town is as close to the front as you can possibly get. Now, the Geneva Convention is very clear that when POWs, right, when you become a POW, you're a non-combatant, you need to be moved out of a combat area. And the reason is because in history, unfortunately, captured troops are often used as human shields. Forcing, it can be a tremendous blow to morale to force an opposing army to kill their own troops in order to kill the enemy. And using your own troops as human shields or pawns is a very common tactic. And the Geneva Convention outlaws this. It says that once you have captured a POW, you need to speed them to the rear. And this also makes just good military sense, right? Who is going to have a harder time getting to friendly lines? A potential escapee or escaped prisoner here who is meters from friendly forces, or if you were to move them far to the rear. I mean, there's certainly no shortage of occupying territories that these prisoners could be held, and it would make the most sense to hold them there where the chances of escape or collaboration are much more limited, right? I mean, literally, they are so close that even a small Ukrainian push, a company or two, a battalion, could just seize the town, extract the prisoners, and withdraw. Very easy to do, extremely risky. All right? Why would you move them to this incredibly vulnerable location? And the answer, I think, is, like I alluded to, I believe that the intention was to either use these troops as human shields and put them in somewhere that they were calling a prison, but was likely adjacent to or dual use as some other military target, which is also extremely a violation of the Geneva Conventions. You cannot hold POWs in a location that is also a place of military significance. It creates events exactly like this, where you functionally are using them as human shields, or you're placing these non-combatants at tremendous risk of being caught in the crossfire. And that is my theory here on what happened. Now, I've the same evidence you do, which is a couple of news articles and the two conflicting reports. But my guess is that this facility probably was, destroyed by Ukrainian fire, who were attacking a legitimate military target. And when they realized they had killed their own troops, Russia sang a song and dance about, this being a deliberate operation by Ukraine. The other thing that I think is really noteworthy that makes me think that this was deliberate by Russia is that Russia is reporting that among the guards at this prison, there were no KIA and only a handful of wounded. The fact that you have basically 100% of these Ukrainian forces who were killed in this attack and 0% of Russian troops killed, says that the Russians deliberately knew this place was going, this prison was going to be fired upon, and withdrew in a timely manner, leaving the prisoners there to get attacked. Again, would not shock me if there was some sort of game. Maybe they were using it as a fire base and they withdrew before the counter battery fire showed up. But in any case, regardless of what the real situation is, it is not an especially egregious one, but it is a violation of the Geneva Convention to hold POWs, especially to deliberately move POWs onto the front lines, which is, I mean, you see the same map I do. That is what they did here. So again, my first thought is that this is probably a Russian move. The other very interesting part is that the U.S. Department of Justice has actually charged a Russian agent. Let's see if we can get his full name here. Alexander Viktorovich Ivanov, who is a FSB agent. He worked under the supervision of the FSB, and he sponsored a variety of what appear to be fringe U.S. groups to do all sorts of anti-U.S. activities and support Russian talking points. So some of them were sort of funny. He'd been at it for a decade, operating in the United States, basically with impunity. So, you know, he encouraged what looks like a pretty extremist socialist group to petition the United Nations for the crime of genocide against the African people in the United States. That's getting me demonetized. Right? Which is, you know, a classic Russian propaganda, taking a issue that has a real core of its truth, right? The, you know, U.S. government's questionable to poor treatment of the black Americans, but exaggerating it into something preposterous, i.e. tantamount to genocide. It's not, and it's sort of insulting to the actual victims of genocide, Armenians, Jews, etc., to make this analog. But more troubling is that he paid to actually have another, I think it's actually the same extremist group or another extremist group, supported their efforts to run for U.S. office, right? Put forth candidates for mayor and the city council in Georgia, right? That's troubling because obviously it calls into question the effectiveness of all of our elected officials, and it really runs the risk of saying, hey, is it possible that other American elected officials have also succeeded, right? You know, you don't know. This was someone who, again, this happened in 2017, so 5+ years ago. Very worrying stuff. And of course, most recently, you see that they paid an unnamed Georgia group to fly from Atlanta to San Francisco to join a protest outside a social media company that had placed restrictions on posts supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So there you have evidence, right, that all of these things are part of the same Russian effort, paying someone to protest outside a headquarters about literally supporting the right to repeat Russian talking points on social media, which, if you look at my comment section, you know that there at least one social media company is not doing a great job of stopping Russian talking points from being repeated. And of course, the common thread to all this, you know, is again the influence of Russia in a lot of things, and the fact that we don't know what hasn't yet been caught. Again, this is one person on a decade-long effort. Who knows what else is out there? Anyway, guys, thanks so much for watching. As always, if you want some breakdowns of videos that are just a little too spicy for YouTube, you want to become members of the Patreon. Thanks again to my Lieutenant tier patrons. I'll see you guys in the next one.